NES Works episode 173 says farewell to 1989 with a wicked good game.
I bought a blender from the Home Shopping Network just so I could have somebody to talk to.
Well, I'm pretty sure that this is the final licensed NES release of 1989, and I've saved the best for last. Well, one of the best. Capcom's Willow is a good time. I admit that there is some personal bias here, or at least some fond memories. Willow is one of those games that a schoolmate lent me with a warning that it was a boring and weird and not very good game, and which of course I immediately fell in love with. That places Willow in the same rarefied space as Rygar and Rambo, two other NES carts whose owners were only too happy to lend them to me indefinitely in favor of borrowing something more enticing from me. I realize that a lot of people don't particularly care for Rygar and Rambo, but they're wrong, and they should feel bad about themselves. Anyway, I don't think Willow had to work quite so hard to prove itself. For one thing, it's a Capcom game based on a licensed property, which means that it emerged from the womb practically guaranteed to be good. Not only was it a Capcom game, it was a Capcom game designed by none other than the father of Mega Man, Akira Kitamura. Apparently his last project at Capcom before moving on to establish Takeru, the plucky little studio that brought us Little Samson and Kokoron. Kitamura was one of those 1980s Capcom designers who had a lot of interesting and good ideas about how games should work, and he brought them to bear here. But also, I don't think Willow had to work quite as hard to connect with NES fans as Rambo or Rygar did, simply because it came along later. When Rygar debuted in the US, the idea of a non-linear action game with an experience system and a lock-and-key structure to the world, not to mention multiple camera perspectives, represented something totally new to console-loving American kids. Rygar broke the seal on Metroidvania concepts for the NES generation, whereas in Japan, it built on a foundation of 1986 releases for Famicom that had already introduced all of those concepts. I happen to know a guy who has produced both a video series and a book about this if you're interested, but the long story short, Rygar shipped for Famicom more than a year after The Legend of Zelda and Dragon Quest, well after Wing of Medulla and the Famicom version of Valis, months after Milon's Secret Castle, Metroid, The Goonies 2, and Kid Icarus. In the US, it shipped well ahead of those games. Kids expected a brawny dude hugging bodybuilder statues and got a precursor to Blaster Master instead. Similarly, Rambo shipped in Japan nearly a full year after Zelda 2, the game it shamelessly impersonated, but nearly a full year before Zelda 2 in the US. So the idea of stabbing butterflies and flamingos before you could accumulate a quiver of exploding arrows, instead of just rolling into the battlefield and immediately detonating things with said arrows, left a lot of kids bewildered. Willow, on the other hand, comes on the heels of all of those games, plus many others. And it immediately jumped out at players for being a whole lot more like the sequel they expected to see to The Legend of Zelda than the actual sequel to The Legend of Zelda had turned out to be. It's a weird little hiccup of history, but even though we take for granted the existence of Zelda-like action RPG games with tons of swordplay from a top-down viewpoint as a given today, those didn't actually appear on US consoles in significant numbers until Nintendo walked back the radical revisionism of Zelda 2 with A Link to the Past in 1992. Up until that point, we had to settle for the rare treat of someone else lifting Zelda's style, like Crystallis. The NES has had a few games that kinda sorta felt a little Zelda-ish in aspect, notably Dragon Power and, if you really want to stretch things, Kung Fu Heroes. But those games were pretty different from the original Zelda, in that the original Zelda was awesome, and they were, let me check my notes here, dog's vomit. So Willow stands out for doing a bang-up job of being an off-brand Zelda, a hit at the good stuff, a fix you could only begin to approximate in the US to this point in time by tracking down a Master System and a copy of Gold Elias. In some ways, Willow almost makes you wonder if it helped inspire Nintendo's approach to A Link to the Past, or at the very least, to its swordplay. To my knowledge, Willow is the first game of this type to enable different types of sword strikes based on how players move as they attack. By default, protagonist Willow performs a sweeping attack by swinging his weapon laterally, but you can also perform a straight piercing strike by attacking as you press in the direction of a foe. This would become a trademark of future Zelda games beginning with A Link to the Past. Willow can also equip secondary tools which tap into his magic meter. As in the third Zelda game, Willow doesn't have innate magic skills, so much as a well of magic power that he can channel through the tools and relics and spell items that he collects along the way. His magic point meter limits his access to spells, but switching skills is as easy as equipping a different tool, a healing staff that restores a certain amount of hit points, acorns that freeze enemies, the ability to summon a circle of fire, and more. Willow is not some straight Zelda clone like Newtopia, which would hit TurboGrafx 16 the following year. And it's not a direct blueprint for Link to the Past either. Willow doesn't adhere to what would become the standard Zelda format of a fairly open world in which players need to perform specific tasks in order to unlock the dungeons scattered about the land. It has more of a linear A to B to C quest structure. As you move across the world, meet characters, and delve into caves and dungeons in order to complete tasks that further your quest and take you ever closer to battling the evil sorceress Bavmorda. I would say the most direct precedent so far in NES would be the Xanadu, a similarly brown game. Unlike in the film that it's based on, or in the arcade game that shares its name, Willow, the protagonist, really just goes it alone here. You meet characters from the movie, of course, and they offer advice and equipment, but the moment-to-moment action involves Willow slugging it out with the baddies all on his own. Oh, I guess we should talk about the arcade game. I see Willow as a sort of counterpart to Strider, an attempt to create a multi-pronged sensation around an external media property. Now, I am under the impression that Capcom had an ownership stake in Strider, along with Motokikaku and Kadokawa. That was absolutely not the case for Willow, an MGM and Lucasfilm Limited property conceived by George Lucas and directed by Ron Howard. Still, Capcom created a couple of complementary games around their license, a sort of cooperative platform combat game for arcades, and this pure Zelda-style top-down action RPG. Neither is 100% faithful to the film, since the arcade game depicts Willow fighting alongside the Daikini rogue Mad Martigan the entire way, while he fights solo on NES. But both interpretations fit their respective platforms. Willow in arcades may not be as successful a work as Arcade Strider was, but Willow on NES feels a hell of a lot more robust and polished than NES Strider, so let's call it a wash. Even if Willow for NES doesn't interpret every minor nuance of the film with suffocating exactitude, it undeniably captures the essence of the movie. Namely, it does a great job of presenting Willow as someone who wasn't necessarily born to be a hero and has to earn his way to that role. As with so many RPG heroes, Willow begins the game weak and fragile and grows in power as he earns experience in combat. Unsurprisingly, for an 8-bit role-playing adventure, earning experience involves a lot of grinding. And if you die before reaching the next experience level, continuing resets you to the baseline of the most recent level you've earned. So does restarting your adventure with a password, even if you record the password before dying with a bunch of experience in the bank. So there ends up being a lot of hovering close to an inn or friendly villager who will restore your health and MP as needed while fighting random mobs. I don't love that part of the game, but it's certainly an element of its era. What I do like is the aptitude mechanic that dictates Willow's combat skills. There is an element of skill gaining here that's tied to levels, and there are certain feats you simply can't accomplish in Willow without having reached specific experience milestones. You can't return the good sorceress Finn Raziel back to her true form until you hit level 13. And you can't beat the final boss, Bavmorda, unless you have earned your way up to level 15, which incidentally is one level shy of the game's hard experience cap. There's nothing super interesting about that, but experience also determines Willow's skill with his weapons. And I don't just mean in the sense of Willow has higher strength ratings at higher levels and therefore hits harder. Rather, each weapon has an innate required skill level that dictates how effectively Willow can wield it. When you acquire a weak weapon, you can swing it freely with no real limitations. It's not going to hit bad guys very hard, but at least you can pathetically pick at them really quickly. A stronger weapon, however, requires greater skill, by which I mean experience. Until Willow reaches the experience level tied to the weapon in question, he'll handle it poorly, as you would expect of an amateur. Willow will swing or stab slowly and clumsily, leaving himself open to attack in the process. Sometimes he may miss entirely with a powerful blade. You're welcome to equip a sword that greatly outstrips Willow's capabilities, but doing so comes with more drawbacks than benefits. What good is it to hit enemies twice as hard if you take a counterattack to the face with every strike and miss half of your attacks in the first place? Willow forces you to reckon with this question throughout the adventure, teasing you with cool new swords that you can't possibly use well. And when you finally do level up enough to be able to disembowel a skeleton with that mystical fire sword, well, that's so satisfying that you won't even have time to ask yourself how the hell you disembowel a skeleton in the first place. Willow isn't a perfect game, but it feels right at home with the DuckTales and Kings of the Beach and Faxanadus of 1989. It looks really good, it has some great, if slightly fragmented music, and it presents a strong secondary gameplay consideration through its leveling acuity system. As with those other games I mentioned, the Willow team understood their assignment and made a damn good game of, if we're being honest, a fairly mediocre film. I mean, Willow the movie was fine, but it was very much a case of Lucas coloring with the same pencils that made him very wealthy with Star Wars. An unlikely young hero finds himself swept up into a grand adventure, both helped and hindered by a handsome rogue of questionable morality who forges an unlikely romance with a fiery-tempered princess as they venture forth to face a guy in a scary mask who serves at the command of an energy-controlling wizard villain in a robe. I mean, Willow himself is a little different than Luke Skywalker, in that rather than being a snotty teen, he's a young adult with a wife and children of his own, whose journey away from home isn't an adventurous escape from his crispy-fried guardians, but rather a mission to use his hard-fought innate magic powers to protect his loved ones. And there's some Bible stuff in here too, with Willow's central mission emerging from his quest to find a real hero to protect the child who showed up in the reeds of a riverbank. I mean, it's still pretty much Star Wars. Heck, Willow's actor, Warwick Davis, even played an Ewok in Return of the Jedi. But I'm sure a lot of people have a fond spot for Willow the film, since it hit VHS right around the time that home video became truly accessible to the masses, and it seems to have been designed as a perfect passive babysitter. And that's totally great. It is very much the kind of movie that kids who were 9 years old in 1988 can be proud of having nostalgia for. It is to elder millennials what The Goonies is to baby Gen Xers like me. Of course, Willow arrived far too late for us. We'd seen Jennifer Connelly in Labyrinth. There was no going back to the innocent whimsy of a movie like this. Anyway, Willow the game makes a fine capstone for 1989. The year that role-playing games exploded on NES, and the year in which Capcom created the best games on NES, hands down. A 1989 RPG by Capcom, well, how could that be anything less than fantastic? Well, that's it for the licensed NES library for 1989. But in classic Steve Jobs style, there's just one more thing. Unfortunately, this one's not a fun, cool thing. The final Hydra head has arrived for 1989, the U-Force from Broderbund. Gosh, and the company has had such a great track record on NES until now. I mean, aside from Deadly Towers. The U-Force attempts to ply the same waters as the Power Glove, and it does so with considerably less success, which is saying something. The Power Glove was not a great way to play most video games, but at least it had some value as an input device. It had precedent in genuinely revolutionary technology, and it looked kind of cool for a certain value of cool. By contrast, the U-Force simply offers a different interpretation of the Power Glove's spatial motion tracking. In a way, it's an interesting effort. It incorporates multiple infrared tracking sensors in order to read hand inputs in a 3D space in a form that almost looks like a laptop computer, but more accurately resembles a Milton Bradley battleship setup. The idea is that U-Force allows you to control NES games by moving your hands through space, which is true, it does that. But as with Power Glove, the U-Force suffers badly from the fact that 95% of NES games do not attempt to represent movement in 3D space. And trying to play Mega Man or Iron Sword by using predefined hand motions that don't really correspond to the character's movement is a terrible, terrible experience. Broderbund did not do anything to help the U-Force by, say, releasing games that actually supported it. They just kinda sent it out and hoped for the best, apparently. I'm only even mentioning it here, even though I do not intend to cover every third-party peripheral to trickle its way into retail for NES, because it's so much more elaborate than most other controllers. Nearly innovative, even. But not good, I'm afraid. Sorry, NES Works 1989. You deserved a better finale than this. Not that the coda is going to be any better. Next time on NES Works, we still have some unlicensed games to look at for 1989, but before we dive into that mess, let's take a breather and be kind to ourselves by looking at some Sega and TurboGrafx games, shall we?